because we did an exit study on election day in 24 November. And, one of the things that stuck out to us before now the voter files are back and we can confirm this, but males showed up in much higher numbers than normal in participation rates, and younger males, specifically non-white males. And there's a lot of overlap between those newer engaged voters and who owns Bitcoin.
And like Brent said, we found not just younger men, but this time around in this iteration of the survey, also non-whites much more likely to own Bitcoin than whites. And so if you look at that demographic of young Hispanic males, that was really influential in this election. There's been a lot of analysis done on that demographic, like why did the Democratic Party, when it came to Trump in particular, lose young Hispanic males? And there's a hypothesis here, which is, well, those are the same people who are getting into Bitcoin, and Trump was speaking to them.
All right, welcome everyone. I'm Renee Sorchik, the VP of Research at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, and today I'm speaking with Brent Buchanan, who's the CEO of Cygnal, and Troy Cross, a professor of philosophy and humanities at Reed College. Welcome, guys. So today we're going to dig in a little bit more. You were both at the summit. You had a very short, very interesting panel, but unfortunately, I think you only had, 5 or 10 minutes? So we're going to dig a little bit deeper on those topics today, give you a little bit more time to go over some of your data. So maybe we can kick it off. Troy, do you want to tell us a little bit about the Nakamoto Project, kind of what it is, what's the goal, and then tell us about your recent findings from the survey? Who owns Bitcoin, and is it who you would expect?
Yeah, thanks, Renee, and apologies for my dark room here. Coming to you from the prison cell that is my office at Reed College. The Nakamoto Project is a sort of a BPI spinoff. We saw a gap in Bitcoin education sort of at the top of the funnel, first touch. What do people think about when they think about Bitcoin? And BPI is I think structured to speak to lawmakers, to regulators of all stripes, and people who are willing to read a brief, people who are willing to even read a one-pager. But there's still the people who don't want to read anything at all. And so actually we thought about addressing that part of the communication stack. What about how do you reach people who maybe have 10 seconds while they walk down a grocery aisle? What do they think about Bitcoin? Anyway, that was kind of our mission, and we started out by doing market research to figure out who holds Bitcoin and what do people think of Bitcoin right now. What's the baseline? And we did a survey a year ago on 3,500 American adults, and our big surprise at that point was that Bitcoin is really for everybody. It's widely owned, much more widely owned than we thought. There were 2 demographic features that really popped out at us, and one of them was Bitcoin owners are young, and the other is that Bitcoin owners are male. Both of those were really striking. But what wasn't there that we expected to be there was a political skew, because in DC, Bitcoin has been politicized, and Bitcoin has been castigated by prominent Democratic politicians on the left, like Elizabeth Warren. It has been praised by prominent politicians on the right, like Ted Cruz. And so we expected, and the same story was told in the media. The same story was told on social media. Everybody kind of who cares about Bitcoin and thought about Bitcoin predicted there would be a massive political skew, and we really found nothing last year in our data to reflect that. Instead, we saw Bitcoin was just owned by all kinds of people across the political spectrum. This year, things were a little different. In the year between last year's survey and this year's, we did the same survey again, 3,500 people, adults in America. we started to see the political skew that we expected last year. It's still slight, but we start seeing things trend in that direction. And our hypothesis is that the two orange brands are colliding, the orange man and the orange coin. And Donald Trump has an amazing brand. It's polarizing. Some people love it, some people hate it. Bitcoin also has a great brand, a lot of brand recognition, and those two brands are kind of fusing as he becomes the crypto president, self-proclaimed, and in various ways embraces Bitcoin agenda. So that's the kind of top level of who owns Bitcoin. I guess another one, the number of people who own Bitcoin. We found 18.6% of respondents claim to own Bitcoin in some way or other this year. That's 48 million American adults, roughly the same number as number of Catholics in America. So not only is it sort of diverse in its holdings, it's also just a lot of people own it. And we'll dig into the details of differences between owners and non-owners, and Brent will go a lot deeper into the verticals. Not saying there aren't differences between owners and non-owners, but what was really striking was the lack of differences. that we thought of Bitcoin ownership would be niche, and it turns out it's not niche. It's very normal, and to me that headline overwhelms the ways in which Bitcoin owners are different. Is that they're similar to non-owners in more ways than they're different.
Interesting. So I do have a question for you, and then we'll go on to Brent about his data. Is it possible that maybe the same people own Bitcoin, but they shifted from being liberal to more conservative? Do you know what I'm saying? So before you had kind of like an even distribution. I mean, you said you shifted a little bit right, but maybe it's not necessarily that more. Do you think that the people they change their political leanings?
Right. There's sort of two questions here. One is we have a general rightward shift. Maybe people in general are more willing to say they're conservative or moderate than they were before, and maybe less likely to say they're liberal. That would show up in our background rate. And our background rate did change, but not very much. Then there's another question, which is, did the Bitcoin owners themselves shift? And that's a much harder question. Not people in general, but Bitcoin owners more likely to identify as conservative, where it's the same people. Something about our surveys, we didn't test any of the same people. We have a fresh sample of a completely new 3,500 people that's disjoint with the previous sample. So we couldn't actually track anybody's personal shift. And, so that's a hypothesis out there. And we simply can't confirm that or deny that hypothesis with our data. I would say there's some of that going on. People might have shifted from independent to conservative, or from liberal to independent, probably as a result of Trump's embrace of crypto.
Right.
So,
exactly.
That definitely could have happened. It's probably, but we can't see that in the data. And in fact, I should say, the skew we see in ownership is not large. The skew that we see in sentiment is. We see a very large skew in the sentiment between last year and this year, but the shift in ownership is very subtle. We measured it in 4 different ways, measured political ideology in 4 different ways, and all of them showed statistically significant shift, but it was sort of like on the border of statistical significance. Whereas for sentiment, we saw liberals dropping off sharply last year. So yeah, what you say is quite possible. Maybe Brent has something more to say.
More details. So Brent, do you want to tell us a little bit about Cygnal and the poll that you did as well?
Yeah, so we conducted a survey back in June in advance of the Bitcoin policy conference, and really we're looking at attitudes around it among likely midterm voters as a whole, but also of those who own Bitcoin, and then how do those views align, and where did they diverge? And really, from a demographic standpoint, came across a lot of what Troy did. The difference between our two surveys is that he's looking at Americans as a whole, and we're looking at likely midterm election, general election voters. And so, when you look at how many Americans are registered to vote, and that's less than 100%, and then you look at of registered voters, how many are going to vote in the midterms, and sometimes you're around 50% or so of registered voters. So we're looking at somewhat different populations there. And
how
I
do you
think
determine that? Do you ask them a question like, "Are you going to vote?" Yeah,
we do. We also have, we've got a battery of questions depending on the methodology of research to get to the likely voter universe. And then a lot of what goes into surveys too is you don't get 100% of the perfect respondents that you need. And so you have to add weight to the survey to get it to look like the population you're surveying. And there's always groups that over or under respond. And you try to control for that best you can. But what we're focusing on really is that kind of 50% of Americans that are going to show up in the midterms. So because that's what, when you're talking about policy, that's who matters to members of Congress. That's who matters to senators up this go round. So they do care about all Americans, but at the end of the day, they really want to know what the people who are going to send them back to office think, or throw them out of office think. And so that's why we focused our research on a bit different audience than Troy did for that purpose, because most of what we do is how do we influence and affect policy with the research. And as we looked at these voters, kind of to go back to some of the things you and Troy were just talking about, is the profile of who owns Bitcoin is a bit different. Yes, psychologically. What do they value? Now, what do they look like demographically is not drastically different, but when you get into value sets, I'll give an example. So one of our questions we were asking, about a financial system, what matters most to them? Is it stability, transparency, fairness, convenience or accessibility, simplicity, physical custody? And so this is of all midterm voters, not just owners of Bitcoin. But when you look at those, even among those who own Bitcoin, there's a pretty big difference of those who hold Bitcoin, whether they voted more or less for Trump, based on which of those attributes mattered most to them in a financial system. So if an owner of Bitcoin who's a midterm voter said fairness or stability, they were much more likely to have been less likely to vote for Trump than somebody who said convenience, accessibility, simplicity. And I think Troy's study gets a lot more into that psychographic profile of this, but that was just one thing as a new Bitcoiner myself over the last couple of years, and then definitely new to the community as a whole, that stuck out to me. But when you think about it, just in terms of what changed in the 2024 election from a turnout perspective, you can see a lot of alignment of the psychology of somebody who owns Bitcoin and the new people who showed up for the first time or the first time in a long time in the 24 election. Because we did an exit study on election day in 24 November. And, one of the things that stuck out to us before, now the voter files are back and we can confirm this, but, males showed up in much higher numbers than normal in participation rates, and younger males, specifically non-white males. And there's a lot of overlap between those newer engaged voters and who owns Bitcoin. And I'm not saying it's a one-to-one correlation, but it was the Bro podcast election, and that's what won it for Donald Trump. And that is, Bitcoin owners are younger, they're more male, they're a bit more educated, they've got a bit more of that risk taker profile. So, and there's tons to dig into in this data, but I think it's just fascinating and to look at the psychology behind it. And one thing that we're looking at moving forward is, do those people stay engaged? Like, they got engaged because Donald Trump made this an issue in the campaign for him. Are they going to be engaged in 26? was the policies that have been passed thus far and that are being talked about enough to keep them engaged, or do they lose interest?
Yeah, those are.
Yeah,
I mean, go ahead, Troy.
I want to jump in with a study that just came out that used actually collected 3 separate sets of data with a small n of 800 and a large n of 2,500 by Kyle Saunders and Aaron Fritz at the Colorado State University on Bitcoin ownership and looking at both Bitcoin attitudes, sentiments, and who thinks positively of Bitcoin and also who owns it and how those groups diverge. And it was these psychological differences were pretty stark between owners and people who simply think well of Bitcoin or they're open to it, but they don't own it. And the difference was that among people who own Bitcoin, they scored high on the quote unquote need for chaos, which is a composite of different measures of basically how open you are to disrupting systems and institutions. So some of the questions they ask for this need for chaos sound really bad, like, disagree or agree. Nothing is happening, and it would be great if like a natural disaster struck a random country. And that's part of like need for chaos. Yes, I know. Who would answer that they agree with that? But the people who are just bored and want things to burn. But other things are like the system is corrupt and it can't be reformed from within. It needs to be destroyed or replaced. And if you agree with that, you score high on a need for chaos. And they found that Bitcoin owners were significantly higher than non-owners, and even people who liked Bitcoin but didn't own it, in need for chaos. Like, what pushes that behavioral lever in getting you from merely thinking about Bitcoin to pulling the trigger? And it's like, you have to be a disruptor. You have to be, at this point, you have to be willing to embrace change. And like Brent said, we found not just younger men, but this time around in this iteration of the survey, also non-whites much more likely to own Bitcoin than whites. Black and Hispanic, I don't really trust our others because the numbers are just too small, but Black and Hispanics were like twice as likely to own Bitcoin as whites. And so if you look at that demographic of young Hispanic males, that was really influential in this election. There's been a lot of analysis done on that demographic, like why did the Democratic Party, when it came to Trump in particular, lose young Hispanic males? And there's a hypothesis here, which is, well, those are the same people who are getting into Bitcoin, and Trump was speaking to them. They're much more likely to use Bitcoin, and they're much more likely to support politicians who say they support Bitcoin. So I think it's a powerful and maybe untold story of the overlap of the people Bitcoin appeals to and the group that shifted for Trump in the previous election. It's like some of those demographics are precisely the same, like Brent said, the podcast election, the podcast bros, but it's also young Hispanic males.
One thing, and I don't know, Renee, if you intended to go down an esoteric rabbit hole, but one of the theories that we've been bouncing around internally, because I'm one of the oldest folks at our firm, and I'm 41. And so we've got a lot of younger folks here. And one of the prevailing thoughts, and we just put out a survey this week asking the question, do you think the American dream is still alive among midterm voters? And it is, I don't have it in front of me right now, but it's in the mid to upper 40s of the number of people that believe that the American dream is still alive. And when you look at people under the age of 30, it's 30% that say the American dream is still alive. And the reason I bring that up is most of the post-World War II institutions that were built have benefited older individuals. It benefited them when they were younger, and it benefits them now. And the bulk of younger people that I know, and especially when you get into minority communities, don't think that any of the institutions that exist benefit them. And not that they just don't benefit them, they actually hold them back. And this is not coming from the research, just from pulling pieces of data that we have access to and open-ended questions that we look through in a lot of our surveys. There is a willingness to try new things that may benefit them more because the existing systems hold them back, not even just don't benefit them, but hinder their ability. And so that would be something really interesting to dig into, is what is your view on institutions and how they serve you? And what is the overlap there between Bitcoin owners? Because I think, that's one of the reasons that I decided to get into it, is that I try to look 20 years down the road and say, okay, do I want all my money tied up in the stock market and some real estate? Or do I really believe that the US dollar is going to be strong and not completely overinflated in 20 years? And my answer is heck no. I don't believe that.
Yeah, just to add to what Brent is saying, this is in Kyle and Aaron's paper, that preprint. And I think there's also a question or two about it in your study too, Brent, on trusting existing financial systems and institutions. And we do get, among Bitcoin owners, we get an anti-correlation with trust in those systems. And so if you put age together with distrust in those systems, and that's more likely to, if you're young, you're more likely to distrust those systems, and if you're older and have benefited from it, maybe more likely to trust them. Then the age gap is partially explained just by that disaffection with the system. Maybe I can share this some visuals, Renee.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Can you see this?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Here's the breakdown of gender and age. As you can see, after 50 Bitcoin ownership, or 55, Bitcoin ownership is really sparse, and the bulge is around 26 to 45 or so. We thought this was really striking. And like Brent said about our institutions, I've been thinking about this too. My students are disaffected with the system, although they tend to be more left-leaning. And that's because, as Brent said, the system has served the old, and really has been, our entitlement system is a transfer of wealth from young to old. Stocks are mostly owned by older people. Gold is mostly owned by older people, although I've read that just recently this year, younger people have been buying gold and changing that ratio. But historically, it's been old people who buy gold. So housing has been owned by older people. So all of the asset inflation that we've had in stocks, real estate, gold, has benefited the elderly. Now, I shouldn't say the elderly, but people on this chart who don't like Bitcoin, over 50. And then they're the ones who have homes that have appreciated 5x or whatever, and their stock portfolio has boomed. Whereas people at the lower end of this are reliant on wages, and also the government is shifting, wealth to the top end of the scale from the bottom, because the bottom end is where income tax is coming from. So I don't think in the under 25 category, that view is widely appreciated or shared from what I can tell from other things that are done. Like, I don't think young people think, oh, Bitcoin is a way that is transferred wealth from older to younger. That's not a common view, but I think it did for millennials and for Gen X, who are involved in it. Obviously, it's the best performing asset in history, and they're the ones who've held it. I think we need to lean into that.
And it's too bad there isn't more research that can definitively show that, the young people, especially maybe the Hispanic group and people who own Bitcoin, came out to vote in a way that they maybe don't normally, and that you should take them seriously. And then also to lobby to them to target that group and say, look, you can make a difference. And if you come out and vote as a collective, you can have a real impact on the future of the country. So I think you have a new slide here. Do you want to?
I was just going to show that very similar results here, but among voters, you see a higher concentration of this kind of 30 to 44, 45 to 54 age range, which makes sense because if you're under 25, the odds that you're registered to vote or going to vote in the midterm are much lower. And so if we're talking about political force here, we've been saying for a long time as a firm that under 55 voters are one of the most key audiences, and they're who decided the last election. They're going to decide future elections. And if this can become a galvanizing issue, not just for persuasion, but also for turnout, I think that's why, and we talked about this some of the conference, that there doesn't seem to be a huge appetite, at least among the folks I spoke to make this a political issue, but everything becomes political. And you either choose how you make it political or it gets chosen for you. That's just how the world works, especially when you add dollar signs to things. And I really see that this is an opportunity for elected officials and those challenging those in elected office that maybe are against freedom in this realm, that there's a huge number of folks who have a vested interest in these policies being put in place, but I just don't think it's being capitalized on nearly enough.
So if a policymaker was listening right now, and given that, Troy, you found roughly 18% of Americans own Bitcoin, and Brent, I thought I read somewhere it was maybe 3 in 10 households, roughly.
Ours was a good bit higher. There's also sometimes when you conduct surveys on a single topic, you get a little bit more participation from folks in that topic than not. And so I would say that the numbers among likely voters is probably more around 25%. If I just randomly ask that question on a likely voter survey as opposed to an entire 50-question survay about a single topic.
Policymakers, they care about the likely voters, right? So, say it's 20.
Let me jump in with just a couple more data points. So that the Cornell group found numbers even higher than ours. The Reynolds Foundation study, they had a huge N. And then Kyle and Aaron's new paper, in their 3 studies, they found numbers ranging between 18 and 30%, depending on their each poll. So a pretty wide range, little suspicious range, but somewhere right in that range. So, Brent's 25 is right in the middle of that. And that's for likely voters, but theirs is for the general population. But this is also a question about whether Bitcoiners will be likely voters. In some ways depends on whether they think that their well-being will be impacted by the election. And Bitcoiners might turn out even more than you expect if they feel threatened or benefited by policy, right? So that's another one I would put a big asterisk on that. If I'm a politician, I'd be like, it's only 25% of voters. Yeah, maybe it's more than that because they all show up, and maybe also this is an issue that they care about, because it impacts their financial well-being directly, and maybe the people who, maybe the people who don't own Bitcoin just don't care that much.
I'll give a quick example because we've thrown this "Do you own Bitcoin or not?" question on a couple surveys after this one, because that 30% felt big, and we've gotten a range of numbers too. But we also ask at the same time, "Do you own stocks?" And that number is oddly consistent, regardless of mode or methodology, because I think if you own stock, you have no problem saying you do or don't own stock. If you own Bitcoin, you're probably a malcontent in some way, and you may own Bitcoin and not answer that you own Bitcoin. And so I think it throws a wrench. And so when you say they found 18 to 30% range across their surveys, that doesn't surprise me very much. There's probably a mode aspect to that, but I would say the larger is that if you own Bitcoin, it says a lot about who you are as a person currently, as we're in the early adopter phase, and whatever's before that, we may potentially be in that phase, is that you're just a unique individual if this is where you've decided to invest your attention and your resources.
How many people own stocks? What's the percentage?
I'd have to pull that back up from our most recent survey, but it was in the 60% range of somebody that owned. But what was interesting is that we asked how much they own. Starting with under 25,000, and then the highest response option we offered was 500,000 or more. And of likely midterm voters, so again, we're talking about less than 50% of the U.S. population here, maybe around 50%, just make the math easy. Less than a third owned 100,000 or more. So this belief that, people care about stocks and how they're doing, and we tell this to our clients all the time, like, quit talking about how the stock market's doing, because the number of people who actually care about today or this year, even how the stock market is doing, they have such limited exposure to it. And so the fact that we found less than a third of people who are midterm voters have 100,000 or more. And then when you got into 500,000 or more, and you're like at 10%. So you're just talking to a very small segment of folks. So that's why I think, just making the correlation, that you got a lot more people who can disrupt the system that own Bitcoin, whether they choose to participate or not in the election, than you do folks who have large exposure to the stock market, because they probably vote in every single election and always have since they turned 18 years old. They're not going to change the outcome of an election. But these younger, more diverse folks who are newer to this, newer to voting, newer to Bitcoin, they're more likely to be able to shake up an election by staying home or showing up.
Yep.
So, given that 1 in 4, that's pretty high, of likely voters might own Bitcoin, what does that mean for policymakers in terms of how they're targeting this group, or maybe the policies they're thinking about? So, like, what should they be thinking about if they want to actually harness the power of this demographic?
I think the most challenging thing, and I actually just got to sit down at with a group of folks involved in this industry, that miners and policy people, exchange folks, and when we were talking about policy, and they were getting into all kinds of nuance. I've never heard so many I bet the Pentagon didn't have as many acronyms as I heard during that conversation with folks. And the reason I give that example is because the number of people who have exposure to Bitcoin is large, but then who care about it is smaller, and then who are interfacing with policymakers is minute. And those people don't look at all like, they don't talk at all like, they don't think at all like the rest of the folks. And I think that's the largest disconnect currently. If you're a farmer, and the Farm Bureau is going to represent you on Capitol Hill on, a state tax issue, they can get regular farmers to make calls to their congressman. They can, when they go in and talk to legislative staffer, that Farm Bureau lobbyist knows how to talk like a regular farmer and represent a regular farmer. I don't necessarily think the Bitcoin ecosystem has evolved enough to where the people interfacing with the policymakers can speak the language of the normal people who are impacted by the policies yet. And that goes with a lot of new technologies, especially one where you're talking about what some perceive as an entirely new financial system. I know it's not, but that is the perception of the policymaker.
This is really good, Brent, and I completely agree. If you look at what's happened on Capitol Hill, we have the Genius and Clarity Acts. How does that really connect with ordinary people? It doesn't. It's clear it was written by elements of the industry, the crypto industry, and that's who pushed the bill, and that's who's happy about it. Ordinary people, even people who are into crypto or Bitcoin, what do they get out of it? What really, how do the things change at all for them, except maybe they won't be debanked, but that's not the Genius Act or the Clarity Act. Maybe they'll be able to use stable coins. Do we really want to use stable coins? My money works just fine. I don't need stables in my life. I already did have them for whatever I wanted to use them for. it's this huge win for people I don't even know or care about. You know, it would be great, like a de minimis capital gains tax exemption for, you know, Bitcoin. Like let us do transactions under $1,000 without capital gains calculations on our Bitcoin. We need something like that to use it as money, to transfer it without, I mean, tracking every purchase with Bitcoin is a nightmare. And we despite the reputation, we're not interested in tax evasion. I would rather avoid prison and deal with my taxes appropriately. But sometimes it's just hard to track everything. Easy to track it in principle if you're Chainalysis or the government and you have access, you can triangulate, but hard if you're actually an individual and you don't remember, like, which wallet did I load where, and did I make sure to include it in my tax software? What was my cost basis on that?
Yeah, exactly.
Tracking down cost basis is really, really hard. Oh, somebody paid me for a conference in Bitcoin, and did I record the date and time of that payment and correlate it with the price of Bitcoin so I know my cost basis? No, I just have to put my cost basis at 0, and when I sell it, or give it to somebody else, I just have to count it as 100% short-term capital gain because I can't find my basis. So, you know, something like that would speak to ordinary Americans. The Strategic Bitcoin Reserve is at least understandable in what it's trying to do. Would it speak to ordinary Americans? Yes, but maybe not in the good ways. For some people, they're like, yay, the government's pumping my bags. For other people, they might be, well, that's wise to diversify a bit into Bitcoin from just gold. And for other people, I would say that's enriching my enemies and more insider self-dealing. But I do think at least it would have a reaction. Like at least the SBR is a proposal that lands with ordinary people. Brent, to your point about the Bitcoin holders and their political activism, we have been engaged in the past on an epic scale. We crushed the phone banks and the email inboxes of Congress like never before. When the right to run a node was threatened, and you know, Janet Yellen tried to slip into a giant bill, you know, the regulations that would require KYC AML for everybody running a Bitcoin node, which is tens of thousands of us, and threatened the very basis of the Bitcoin freedom. When that happened, Congress was shocked. We shut down the whole bill. We brought the country to a standstill, and Washington noticed us for the first time. Since that moment, that was 4 years ago. Since that moment, nothing like that has happened since that has marshaled the, you know, broader Bitcoin crypto ecosystem of owners, because we can't really get worked up about stablecoin legislation and exactly who gets to offer interest on what product. Like we're not bankers, so I think some of this is it's our job. It's actually a job of groups like the Bitcoin Policy Institute to frame the political issues that do matter. I mean, we do have political issues that matter. De minimis is one, but also something BPI is pushing for is just the right to write software without worrying about ending up in jail for what someone does with your software. And we've lost a recent case at the federal level for someone who wrote privacy protecting software. But we also have, you know, a piece in the Clarity Act preserving that. And so that's something where I think Bitcoin holders can rally behind, but we have to marshal that army too.
Well, to put a bow on that, it's human psychology. You're more likely to take action to protect yourself from loss than you are to seek gain. And you know, when you're threatened, yes, they'll marshal, but how do you marshal them towards positive policy, not just stopping negative policy?
Yeah, and
So,
the traditional
and
Bitcoin stance is like all policy is negative policy too. You know what I mean? The people who did, I guess, going into your question, Renee, about who's shifting among Bitcoin owners. If you roll back the clock 4 years, at least the public owners were very hesitant to do anything with politics. They were people who didn't even like to vote. They kind of had opted out, like they were anti-government. And actually, it was the threat through Janet Yellen on the ability to legally run a node that I think was a tipping point for a lot of Bitcoiners that said, okay, I guess we have to do something with this government thing. But we're still very far, Brent, from, seeing, you don't feel comfortable in the political space. A lot of Bitcoiners themselves reacted really negatively to the strategic Bitcoin reserve for the same reason. Like, yes, I love Bitcoin, but I don't want the government to have any of it. That sounds like a terrible idea. So you had within the big, for the biggest policy push we have made as a Bitcoin community, which is the SBR, we had a significant portion of Bitcoiners fighting in a rearguard action, fighting against that. And so that's we're very far from, nuanced positive policy pieces, and then bringing everybody out to call their congressman and stuff like that. I think we can do better on that front, a lot better.
So if policymakers were to try to target this demographic, Bitcoiners look a little bit different than the voting demographic. They might be younger, they're more male-leaning. You just said, Troy, that they're twice as likely to be non-white, like the Blacks and Latino had a twice ownership rate. So is there a way that policymakers could appeal to them, but without alienating the general voting population at large?
That's a good question. Our data shows that if we're just looking at midterm voters and midterm Bitcoin owners, that over a third of them are between the age of 30 and 44. And then another almost quarter, 45 to 54. And they're 60% male. They're more likely to have a college degree, they're higher income. They are the same diversity of ethnicity as midterm voters. And I think that was one of the most unique things to me, especially if you rewind this conversation to what Troy and I were talking about with non-white voters, especially younger non-white males. Well, if you participate in midterm elections, there is almost zero difference between Bitcoin owners of midterm voters and all midterm voters. And it was one of the only things that was nearly identical between the two audiences that we looked at within the survey. So what I would say is, because one of the other pieces that sticks out about this group is, when we look at election turnout and when somebody's building a voter file of who am I going to go talk to, because I think they're going to turn out in this election, we start with the voter file. And one of the first things we look at is how many of the last 4 general elections have you participated in, especially that you've been eligible to participate in. And when you look at that factor, people who own Bitcoin and are midterm voters are lower frequency voters. So, if you're going to try to engage this audience, you're talking to a slightly different group of people, even just in their voting behaviors. And so that would be one of the recommendations, not if you're an elected official talking to Bitcoin owners, is to be thinking about how do you use this issue as a turnout mechanism. Because the other demographics, especially if you're a Republican, the other demographics mean that they probably are voting for you, or they have a propensity to vote for you on value similarities. But this group also, if they stay home, benefits Democrats. So, I think that's a really unique electoral proposition, which is different from the policy side of things.
Unless Democrats shift their stance, right?
Yeah.
So,
Renee, I think it's a great question. I think if you want to reach these groups and tell them they're heard, that's you could show a little bit of knowledge about it. You could display that you've actually thought about it and that you understand them. You understand their disaffection with the system. You understand that it hasn't served them well. and you support alternative ways for them to achieve wealth. I think some of it is just like particularly minority communities, telling them you support their desire to build wealth. I had this conversation with Ro Khanna where he said, he talks about his involvement in the civil rights movement and his meeting various figures in the civil rights movement back in the day. He talks about this to his audiences in Atlanta and other like Black audiences, and like the young men don't care about that. They want to know how they can build wealth. They want to know how they can build a successful business, how they can achieve a career. So I think just like as a Democratic politician, show that you understand that this community has not been well served by the current system, and that you are supportive of them building wealth and building other systems to create success for themselves. I think that's a message that would resonate with that audience. Just generally educate yourself about Bitcoin, distinguish it from the scams. What is your role really as government? You want to allow innovation to thrive. You do have a role in consumer protection by not rubber stamping pure scams. And I think of course I think the Democrats have a strategy here, because I'm a Bitcoiner, which is to point out the unique features of Bitcoin as a money that was launched fairly, that didn't have any insiders, that were unduly rewarded, which is genuinely community governed. And I would lean into that. I would say we have an example of money that's controlled by elite institutions, which make those institutions themselves more wealthy, and that's the purpose of them. And then we have something that was started from the ground up by a group of people interested in freedom, and that's spread throughout the world, and which is controlled by no one and is a neutral money. And I would contrast and be knowledgeable about the difference between a neutral money and something that has a 50% pre-mine and is simply rewarding insiders, money printing. To date, very, very few politicians have made that distinction, and I think there's tremendous ground there. And if I were advising Democratic politicians, I would be hyper aggressive on calling out Trump family's self-dealing, and they're launching scam coins. And I would tell my constituents and my colleagues not to confuse that with advances in technology, like a distributed ledger, which is genuinely decentralized, and a supply of money that is limited and doesn't allow money printing to redistribute wealth in ways that serve the powerful. I would just lean into those differences, articulate what's good about Bitcoin, and of course lean into the innovation angle. Like, this thing isn't going away. It's been here 15 years now. People have been saying it's bad. They've been saying it's a scam. They've been saying it's dead. They've all been wrong repeatedly. And everybody who has listened to them has lost money. And so all the politicians who have basically been purporting to protect people from scams have actually cost them generational wealth by that protection. There's a certain amount of respect that you need to have for your constituents, respecting their ability to assess risk and take it. And when Paul Krugman was arguing we should regulate all this away, or Elizabeth Warren, all they did was keep the people that they claim to care about poor, because they didn't respect their ability to judge risk in an investment. And instead, what happens is that only rich people are allowed to take risk. They're only accredited investors are allowed to get into, the pipeline, and they 10x investments. And people, ordinary working people, poor people, don't have an opportunity to get in on anything good in this economy because they're regulated out of it. And Bitcoin has been one of the rare exceptions where the people who got in weren't rich, they weren't old, and they didn't have to be accredited. And then have politicians come along now and say, Oh, you shouldn't have access to that. That's gotta grate. Particularly the segment of young males that we're talking about. They like to take risk. Young men are more risk happy, more risk comfortable. And it's those people who moved into this space. They're really not going to want to be told that they shouldn't be allowed to take those risks and only rich people should be allowed to take them. I'd lean into that as a politician. We respect your right to assess risks, and we think that the economy and the gains from the economy, the tremendous gains in productivity that we've had, should be accessible to everybody, not just the elites.
So, Troy, you dropped a real banger at the end of your session of the summer, and you said that that there's really no downside to Democrat politicians publicly supporting Bitcoin. So, I mean, you said there's a few caveats to that, and like maybe you want to maybe I wonder if you can elaborate that, because it was right at the end of the session and I wanted to hear more, but you were closing out. But then you've also since said there's a few maybe asterisks you want to put in there. So maybe both of you want to kind of talk about what do you mean by that?
Well, this is actually something I saw in Brent's data, the Cygnal poll. One of the questions that they asked was, if a politician says they support Bitcoin, does that make you more likely to vote for them, less likely, or not vote for them, more likely to support them, less likely to support them, or neither? And some of those statistics were really striking, like black voters. 50% of them were more likely to support a candidate who expressed support for Bitcoin. That was just ridiculous numbers, almost hard to believe. But in general, independents were, there we go. There it is. Independents were more likely to support candidates who express support for Bitcoin. But yeah, if you look at this, of course, Bitcoin owners are more likely to support candidates who support Bitcoin, but that's 1 in 4. But the 3 and 4 are the don't. But look at even just overall, 43% of people are more likely to support a candidate who expresses support for this. That's tremendously high, and only 25% unsure and 32% less likely. And then digging into the numbers, here's where the caveats come. Among Democratic voters, the less likely is slightly higher. It's a few percent higher than the more likely among Democratic voters. Yeah, there it is, 38-42. So you have a 4% difference that's there for Democrats. So there is a downside, maybe in a primary, maybe if this issue is really intense, there's a very slight cost, but the overall gap between 32 and 43 is 11 points, and that's much more significant, right? So yeah, the downside, I shouldn't say there's no downside, very, very small downside. And I would
The other thing I'll add too, if you're looking at this from a politician standpoint, if I handed this over to somebody running for office or running for re-election, one of the things that's going to draw their eyes is this section right here, which is what we call X of 4. So how many of the last 4 general elections have you participated in? And the 0 to 1 of 4 is either new registration, so they registered since the last election, or they voted in one of the last 4. Most of the time what this means is they're a newly registered voter. Not that they decided 1 time out of 4 times to show up to vote. It almost exclusively means that they registered since the 22 election and participated in 24, which means they have participated in 100% of the elections that they have been eligible to vote in for general elections. And when I look at this here, and I'm asking myself as a politician or candidate for office, how can I use this to my advantage? I look at this as a turnout tool, because these 4 perfect voters almost don't give a rip is the best way to read this. A third more likely, a third less likely, a third unsure, if we're just rounding and getting real rough round numbers. So they don't care. But as I scale down the lower propensity or newer voter scale, which is the best way to read these data points right here, it gets exponentially more important, and the gap between more and less likely grows. So to Troy's point, the drag decreases as the propensity to vote or the newness to vote shifts. And so this is what I'm looking at, and I'm going, okay, I better be talking to these people about this issue, because this is how I'm going to get these newer voters and these slightly less frequent voters to come out to vote. I have found a topic that's going to work.
Yeah, and if you think long term too, the people who this matters to are coming into the voting age, and every day the Bitcoin haters, more of them are dying. And it's sad to say, but we lost Charlie Lemunger recently, and we'll lose Warren Buffett. We'll lose some of the classic haters. They're gonna go. And just broadly looking at my age chart, right? Time passes. that thing moves up as the population grows into voting age and dies out of it. And then the Democratic stance on this stuff, it's the long term. When people decide, this is a general marketing truth. This demographic of like 16 to 25 is hugely important, because the human mind is more plastic at that age, and it changes form, and then after that it changes very slowly. This is why people like the same music that was popular when they were in high school, and why they very often dress like they did in college when they're 50, because somehow their tastes were, and I plead guilty to both of those things, their tastes were set in their youth. It's also why I like teaching college, because people are still at an age where they can change. But and marketers know this, because it's like people will stick with a bank, for instance, that they choose in college, try to sign you up for a bank account, not because college students are great clients, they don't have any money and they overdraw their accounts, but because they know that if they get you in the system with Chase or Wells Fargo or whatever, they're going to have you potentially there for life because of the friction of shifting.
I use a bank in Alabama, and I'm sitting here in D.C.
There you go. So think about, Democrats need to think long term. Bitcoin, so far, many Democrats have built reputations on bashing this thing, which has not done anything but improve and entrench, and the number has just gone up. That's an incredibly costly reputational alliance that they are making. And the flip side is true for those politicians who have embraced the technology, learned about it, become expert in it. They've gotten people. I have to say, I already had incredibly negative opinions about Ted Cruz before he started talking about Bitcoin. He speaks really well about Bitcoin. He understands Bitcoin. He hasn't won me over. I don't think I would vote for that guy, but I can see him building a coalition of Bitcoin supporters, actually, despite people who never would have looked his way twice, and they will probably support him and follow him campaign after campaign as long as he wants, right? And that's anyway. There's opportunity and there's cost here for cementing your brand with a stance on a technology that not only do the youth embrace it, but it's not going anywhere. Really, and Brent said this to me at the conference, there's a very real risk here for Democrats to cut down their constituency, to exclude young males and young minority males, and leave themselves with a heavily female biased, older set of voters. And yes, they'll get some of the Zamdani socialist youth, but they could lose a lot of the youth who are interested in making their own way in life, rather than working at a state-owned grocery store. They will lose them, right? So there's a very real risk of future irrelevance of the Democratic Party on this. And Republicans actually have a moment to lean into this youthful, tech-friendly, innovation-friendly freedom-friendly movement and cement themselves with a younger generation that will remember.
So long as they do something. And that was the point I was making at a recent policy discussion was there's going to be a what have you done for me lately challenge. If Republicans get in here and they ran on this topic and then they passed two pieces of legislation that I would disagree with you a little bit, Troy. I think they matter as foundational pieces to dip the toes of members of Congress into this issue in a way that they can understand before going broader. But if we stop at those two bills, and then, and I say we because I do Republican work and rest up and say, okay, I can't wait for the voters to pour in, we're screwed. And what Republicans in power are going to have to do is actually figure out what else needs to be passed from a policy perspective, or what threat is on the horizon that I can protect Bitcoiners from. Because if it's simply, I'm for you, I'm rooting for you, and you don't do anything from a policy perspective, you're going to lose these folks as fast as they came on the train.
I totally agree. I think it's real danger, and it's a real shame that what we have is lobbying by people who are self-interested, and many of them looking for a quick buck or a headline. XRP just wants announcements of its latest integration with banks or whatever. And we need to be thinking long term, and we need to be thinking ourselves ethically about what benefits ordinary people who would vote, and which we can bring back to the voters and say, this is what we did. And I agree, Brent. I think we needed regulatory clarity. We need regulatory clarity for other things to happen. The bills are important, but they don't speak to ordinary people.
Maybe that's a good place to wrap. Unless you got any other closing big thoughts.
No, just thanks for the opportunity to have this discussion.
Yeah.
I think it's an important one, and it's at such a formative stage in being able to create and drive the policy and the processes that get that conversation to the policymakers, and that's how Bitcoiners need to be thinking. Is I'll give the example of this in closing, that for many years, Facebook, now Meta, and Google refused to lobby Congress because they felt that Congress would understand nothing about their technology and only get in the way. And now look at who the largest spenders on lobbying are. If you want to long-term make an impact, you got to play heavy in elections so that there's some stick with the carrot, and you have to have an organized and consistent policy communication effort to influencers around the Hill and people who actually vote on the Hill, or it becomes a pipe dream.
Great. I want to add just I want to say thanks to BPI for helping me communicate the results of our study and helping us think it through. And thanks to Brent for your involvement and this poll you ran, which was super insightful. I hope that the viewers of this webinar can access both of these studies. Mine's available at nakamotoproject.org, and maybe hopefully on this site as well. And you can follow me at the Trocro, but you should follow Brent as well, and definitely read the survey. It's really accessible, Brent's, and there's tremendous amount of data to be mined there. Tremendous amount of data to be mined.
Mined, I like it. Good closing pun there, Troy.
Brent, where can people find you?
Our website is cygn.al. Social is cygnal. Personal is Brent BUC. And we do have the study on our website, and you can even just search Cygnal Bitcoin, CYGNAL Bitcoin, and it'll take you right to it on pretty much Perplexity, Google, doesn't matter, it'll get you there.
Perfect. And we'll link it in the show notes as well. So thank you so much, guys, for coming on today and speaking more about your amazing studies.